So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today on our first live session of our 5-week EVO course. And can you actually see the screen? Can you see the slides? Yeah, good. Okay, so you notice that I did something special in the slides. So if you know what font it is, put your answer in the chat box. So because we chose a special font here to fit today's topic, which is talking about actually visual thinking and dyslexia. So, and I just hand over to Katrin Lichterfeld, who's going to introduce our speaker for today. Katrin?
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Yes, I'm very pleased that we shift our perspective today to learners with special educational needs. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Martin Bloomfield, a well-known expert for dyslexia. And we are thankful that Martin is sharing his expertise. In 2020, he was a British Council Elton's finalist with his website, Dyslexia Bites, which received the judges' commendations for equality, diversity, and inclusion. I would also like to introduce our colleague Grace Alkini, who is taking care of the chat as well. So should you have any questions in between, which may not be answered by Martin in the breaks after his short talks, we will have a further opportunity at the end of this talk to answer final question. Please check that you are all muted, and over to you, Martin.
Thank you very much indeed. And actually, I'm going to ask people to speak. So at various points, I'd love it if people could unmute themselves as well, because that's I like the dynamism and the interactivity of that. I had planned an entire PowerPoint presentation, but I'm not going to do that because I am in transit in Stansted Airport at the moment, excitingly going to an Erasmus Plus meeting on a project I'm running, which is looking at how different European nations measure dyslexia differently. And it's absolutely fascinating. And even within the same nation, you'll get different measurements of dyslexia. And unless we can measure it the same, we can't understand how to accommodate for it. And one of the reasons people don't measure it the same is that very few people agree on what it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you a question. Katrin or somebody, can you, Kirsten, in fact, can you open up the Jamboard, please, for me? Thank you very much. Now, for those people who don't do Jamboard, what we have is if you have a link for the Jamboard, what we have on the Jamboard is here, we have the ability to put in Post-it notes. Kirsten, do people have the ability to write Post-it notes here on this Jamboard? I think they should. Perfect. Thank you very much indeed. So once you've got the ability to write Post-it notes, what I'd like you to do is essentially, I'd like you to, there we go. I'd like you to post in this particular link so you can access the Jamboard. Page 2 of the Jamboard, please. And what we have is I would like it very much if I'm going to ask you a specific question. So go to the Post-it notes on the side. So if you know how to use Jamboard, just go to the side and there's a list of things at the side. One of them is a Post-it note. And all I would like you to do is just write on one Post-it note, one thing you associate with dyslexia. It could be slow reading speed or writing letters backwards or something. And then take another Post-it note and write another thing you associate with dyslexia. And then another Post-it note and write another thing you associate with dyslexia. Thank you very much. I'll just give you maybe 2 minutes for everyone to do this. Thank you. This looks great. Beautiful.
Can I just say something? I'm just right. I'm going to rearrange them Yeah, so leave that to me. Just put them there.
Yeah, don't rearrange them yet. We're going to do something with them later on. So we'll just put
You
them on
can
the
do
board.
that. I just want to make sure that people can read everything. So that's okay.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
It's not. I'm not doing clustering, Martin, but
oh, that's okay. Great.
Sometimes people wonder, oh, I'm writing on top of something, someone, and that doesn't matter really.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, this is great. Let's get some more going. That's excellent. 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 I love that. Numbers don't work. What a really nice way of putting it. I love this exercise. I've done this for a number of years, and I notice patterns, what people say. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Lovely, lovely, lovely. Spelling off the charts. I love that. Panicking about writing, reading but not getting it, confusing letters, being scared of reading. Wonderful. Mixing letters and sounds when reading. Perfect. Perfect. Okay, so we'll call a pause to this at the moment. This is really, really good. I love what people have written. Thank you so much. We'll call a slight pause to this and we'll come back to it later on because I think it's quite useful and it's quite interesting. So the reason I did this, there's a number of reasons I did this. One of the reasons is to just find out, get people interacting and to get people taking part in this. But another is just to find out what people think about dyslexia. And what we've got is we've got here towards the right-hand side, we've got creative thinking, and that's a fascinating thing to say. I'm going to share my screen at some point. Not yet, but I'm going to share my screen at some point. But I run a project called Dyslexia Bytes. And on the Dyslexia Bytes project, I have a section called About Dyslexia. And one of these About Dyslexia sections talks about dyslexia and creativity. We often say dyslexic people are creative thinkers. Dyslexic people are visual thinkers. But what do we mean when we say this? Well, let me explain. First of all, when we say dyslexic people are creative thinkers, we're actually using a lot of empirical studies to say this. If you look at the website, and I will show you the website, thank you very much. If you look at the website, you will notice that there's a section called Dyslexia Bytes about dyslexia, and it says dyslexia and creativity. And it highlights at least 20 independent academic studies, each one of them showing that dyslexia is actually linked with creativity. Dyslexic people perform better on standardized creativity tests or non-standardized creativity tests. They perform better in creative environments. So we know that dyslexia, generally speaking, is linked with creativity. Thank you, Katrin. What we also know is that dyslexia is linked with the ability to connect concepts together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to imagine your brain. And your brain, as everybody knows, is in 3 sections, although there is some debate about this. But there's the what you would call the reptilian section, or the brain stem. There's the limbic section, the big bit of the brain. And on the outside, there's the cortex, the outer cortex, the neocortex. I'm not going to get too technical about this. On the cortex, absolutely everybody has stacks of neurons, like little stacks of neurons sticking up on the outer of the cortex. And these are called minicolumns. This is a fascinating thing to understand. There is a difference in the dyslexic minicolumns from the non-dyslexic minicolumns. And in fact, there's also a difference in the autistic minicolumns. And I think it's really useful just to highlight what these differences are. So if you look at the minicolumns on the autistic brain, the minicolumns quite short, they're quite thick, they're bunched really close together, and there's lots and lots and lots of them. If you look at a dyslexic brain and you see the minicolumns, actually the minicolumns are thinner and they're a lot taller, and there aren't quite as many of them, and they are spaced further apart. What they call the neurotypical, the non-dyslexic, non-autistic brain, the minicolumns are somewhere in the middle. They're medium-sized, there's a medium number of them, and they are spaced a medium distance apart. Now, what's interesting about the minicolumns is that this is one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways in which the brain communicates information to itself between different areas of the brain. And the information shoots up and down in electronic pulses, let's be simplistic, at the same speed. So with an autistic brain, it goes from the bottom to the top of the minicolumns a lot faster than it does with a dyslexic brain, because the autistic minicolumns are shorter, so it doesn't take as much time to get from the bottom to the top. With the dyslexic brain, the minicolumns are longer, so it takes longer time to get from the bottom to the top. Similarly, in terms of transmissions between these minicolumns, essentially, it's not quite like this, but these electronic pulses jump from minicolumn to minicolumn. Now, in the autistic brain, because they're bunched really close together, this communication is really quick. In the dyslexic brain, they're not bunched so close together, so the communication is really slow. And in the non-dyslexic, non-autistic brain, it's somewhere in the middle. And in the autistic brain, they're bunched really, really close together, and there's lots of them. And the dyslexic brain, they're a little bit further apart, not quite so many of them. What this does is it explains why people on the autism spectrum, they tend to process a lot of information really quickly. And we know this from the studies. They process an awful lot of information really quickly. And their process is very localized. So their thoughts are very focused. They see detail. Dyslexic brains, on the other hand, process information slightly slower. We know this. This is empirically and scientifically verified. Dyslexic brains process information slightly slower. However, because the minicolumns are spaced further apart, there is a greater connectivity between different parts of the brain. What this means is that what's going on is that the dyslexic brain is not focusing on detail. The dyslexic brain focuses on connections between different cognitive functions. In other words, the dyslexic brain contains a lot of understanding of structures, understanding of links, of connections between things that other people might not see connected. So because of the shape of the brain, autistic people see detail and get really overloaded with information, cognitive and sensory information. Dyslexic people don't get overloaded with that kind of information. They process information slightly slower, however, they see the big picture. And this is one of the key facts to being, as it were, connected, creative. So dyslexic people neurologically are built to see the bigger picture. And when we process information slower, by the way, it doesn't mean very slowly. It doesn't mean an intellectual retardation. It simply means that sometimes we have what we call auditory processing disorder. That is, if you say something, it takes a split second longer to process it. That's all that means. But it does mean that the dyslexic brain tends to see connections where other people cannot see connections. It tends to see structures. You cannot see structures. And this is one of the reasons why we believe very firmly that there is neurological grounding for dyslexics being creative thinkers. It's also extremely good reasoning for us to understand what we mean when we talk about dyslexic people being visual thinkers. So let's just look at the visual thinking aspect of dyslexia for a second. The parahippocampal area of the dyslexic brain is larger than the parahippocampal area of the non-dyslexic brain. Again, I don't want to blind people with science. I'm going to be very simplistic when I say this. There is, research has shown, a trade-off because the parahippocampal area does two things that we're interested in. One of the things is it deals with memory, and the other thing is it deals with visualization. Well, it appears that the visualization cognitive function within the dyslexic brain is far more developed than the non-dyslexic brain, but the memory section is less developed. And so there is, as we say, a working memory deficit for people who've got dyslexia. So a working memory, just to let people know what that is essentially, it is the ability to take in information, usually through the ears, remember it, and then apply it very, very quickly. Why is this important? Because as teachers, often what we do is we give them information such as, here is a rule, and then we ask them to apply the rule. Now, for people with dyslexia, telling somebody a rule and making them apply that rule is an inappropriate way of helping them learn. What is an appropriate way of helping them learn, however, is utilizing the creativity and the parahippocampal area of the brain so that we ask people to visualize things and visualize, as it were, categories, visualize their own structures and understand things in that particular way. One particular way of doing this, a very simple way, a very simple example. I was teaching, many years ago, I was teaching English and I had to teach prepositions. And the preposition I was supposed to teach for that particular session was over. That was the preposition, over, O-V-E-R, over. And instead of telling people how to use the preposition over, I got people to think of as many phrases as they could using the preposition over. Think of as many novel titles, as many book titles, as many song titles, as many movie titles, as many phrases, as many idioms as they could using the word over. And on each one and for each one, write it on a piece of paper or a sticky post-it note. And then I got people to arrange them in their own categories. And this is how you use the word over. They worked out because they could see their own categories. They could engage with the activity and understand how they believed over was used. And this is an engagement and it's a form of constructivism. And it places no stresses on working memory at all. And so if you want to get over working memory issues, we need to, as it were, create categories. We need to stop asking people to remember rules and then apply them. Great wordplay jokes. I love that one. I've just seen that. Great wordplay jokes. I really love that. So what we know, people with dyslexia are creative. We know they're visual, and we also know that they are constructivist in how they think. And they need to see structures and they need to create the structures. One of the ways of doing this is by visualizing. Dyslexic people are highly, highly visual. There is something called eidetic memory. Eidetic memory is the ability to essentially have a photographic memory, remember images almost precisely. What dyslexic people cannot do, they don't have a good working memory, but all the studies show dyslexic people have a highly developed photographic, eidetic visual memory. And this feeds into the notions of the parahippocampal area, and it feeds into all sorts of notions about visualization. So we do know that people with dyslexia rely on visualization, they rely on creating their own concepts, they rely on the structures that they create, and they cannot rely as much on working memory. So this is the first thing we know about dyslexia. Okay, now I'm not going to talk too much before I'm going to open this up for conversation. So I'm going to open this up for conversation very, very, very quickly indeed. There are downsides to dyslexia. So it's neither a superpower nor an illness. There are downsides to dyslexia. The major downside to dyslexia that everybody knows about is something called phonological processing. Now, phonological processing is essentially the ability to read a word and hear it in your brain. That's the general description of what phonological processing is. You read a word and you hear it in your brain. Now, for people who teach international students, you will find that those people from the Far East, from China, from Japan, they will have phonological processing difficulties anyway, because their language structure is not phonological when it's written down. And actually, when people in China read Chinese script, a different part of their brain is working. It's about here, and it's part of the visual aspect of the brain that's working. They're not phonologically processing, which goes on here. And so when we teach Chinese students, we expect them to have phonological processing difficulties anyway. There are ways of getting past phonological processing difficulties. I shall explain. The first way is just make sure that when you're teaching any kind of reading and writing, make it multisensory. This is the first thing to do, because that stops the reading and writing from being purely phonological. It makes it multisensory by touch, by movement, by spoken word, multisensory teaching. The second thing we can do is by using colors, So what you can do is you can break up the parts of the word, the morphemes of the word, for instance, using colors, and people can see how a word is spelt, and they can see how a word is constructed using colors. And finally, the third thing you can do is we can play games, tapping out games, for instance. Or there's a game called Broken Telephone, where I whisper a word into somebody's ear, and they have to whisper the same word into the next person's ear. This is, again, it's a way of practicing phonological processing. Or there's a game where I say a word, for instance, Martin, and that begins with an M and ends with an N. And the next person has to say a word that begins with N, so November. And the next person has to say a word that begins in the schwa sound, so appropriate. And the next person has to say tooth fairy or something. So you have to be able to identify the phonemes in a word. Little games like this really help people with phonological processing. The second negative of dyslexia is what we call executive function. And executive function, I like describing it in terms of this. Almost everybody in the world has a personal assistant or a secretary living inside their brain. People with dyslexia don't have always that personal secretary or that personal assistant living inside their brain. That personal assistant performs certain roles: organizing, prioritizing, planning out tasks, knowing how to start a task, knowing when to finish a task, being able to change from one task to another. This is what a personal assistant helps the executive do. People with dyslexia often struggle with what we call executive function, being able to initiate a task and then plan out and how to prioritize what to do and make sure that I do this by this time and this by this time and this by this time and this by this time. And by the way, I'm dyslexic, and people who know me know that executive function is one of my major challenges with dyslexia. And it's a very overlooked aspect of dyslexia. So I'm just going to stop, and I'm going to ask you to unmute, and I'm going to ask for questions before we go on to the next section. Any questions about what we've said? I'd love people to engage and ask a few questions. Don't be shy.
Okay, Martin, again, as I said earlier on, I'm madly dyslexic. My son is, my father is, I have two nephews who are. We all wear glasses.
Yeah. What you'll notice, I don't know about the glasses so much. When you say you all wear glasses, what do you mean by that?
Well, we
just
all
spectacles,
have,
like I'm wearing now.
For some functions in our life, we need spectacles, yes.
Yeah. I couldn't comment on dyslexia and spectacles because this would be a visual processing issue. But what I can say is that it runs in the family. So you say your uncle, your father. So it's highly likely. And in fact, the statistics are really interesting. If one parent has dyslexia, there is a more or less 50% chance that any child they have will have dyslexia. If both parents have dyslexia, there's a chance approaching 100% that the next child will have dyslexia. So you say it runs in your family, it's very, very highly likely. They've identified about 5 genes that may well be to do with dyslexia.
But back to the glasses, also, what is with this visual messaging? Because it's sending, your eyes send messages to your brain, but there is a mismatch, if you like, of messages being sent.
There is, I'm writing a chapter for a book at the moment on dyslexia and visual processing. And what's really interesting is that visual processing issues are highly, highly controversial in the world of dyslexia. Most people, when they talk about dyslexia and visual processing, they don't mean what we call dyseidesia, which is about eidetic memory. They don't mean people who cannot see things or whatever. What they mean is what they call Myers-Irlen syndrome, or Mears-Erland syndrome. I'll write this in the chat box for everybody. Now, you can sometimes hear it called Mears-Erland syndrome, and sometimes you'll just hear it called Erland syndrome. Now, Erland syndrome is a fascinating topic. It's not dyslexia, it's a visual processing disorder. But between about 30% and 47% of people with dyslexia have got some form of Erland syndrome. And if anybody ever hears this classic, dyslexia is when words move around on a page, that's not dyslexia, that's Erland syndrome. So Erland syndrome is the visual processing problem. It can be, I have it to a certain extent. So when I see any pattern at all, it doesn't have to be words. When I see a pattern, I see some form of movement, I see flashing lights, I see shimmering almost. Can I share my screen? Would that be okay? I'm just going to show you something.
Of course,
right.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Right, so here we go. Right. I wasn't planning to do this, but I think it might be a nice idea. I think it might be a very nice idea indeed. This one should do nicely. Yeah, this one will do nicely. Right. So, okay, right, here we go. So back to Skype, so back to Zoom, and let's share my screen. Can everybody see this this image in the middle?
Yes.
You may see, not everybody will, but you may see movement in this image. If I change it to this image, you may see movement in this image. Now, the image doesn't move. You can put your finger on the screen and you'll notice there's no movement. The image itself doesn't move. But what's happening is your brain is creating movement in the image. And this is essentially what Myers-Erland syndrome feels like a lot of the time. It certainly feels like that to me. That's what I see when I see written words. I also see it, and if I see closed patterns on carpets, or if I look at a work of art with very close patterns, I'll see that kind of movement. It's a visual processing disorder. It's not dyslexia. Dyslexia happens in various parts of the brain. Erland syndrome, nobody quite knows where it happens, but it's something to do with visual processing, not phonological processing, not working memory. But there is, of course, this connection. Between 30% and 47% of people with dyslexia have Erland syndrome to some extent. And so it's very easy for people to think, oh, you're dyslexic, you see words moving around on a page, even though that's not what dyslexia is. There is something else which we can talk about as well when we talk about visual processing and dyslexia. One of the fascinating things, I searched and searched and searched, and eventually I found the clever people at MIT or NASA or Google, I don't know who it was, but some clever people anyway, they created some glasses which could track what your eyes do as you read. And this is fascinating stuff. I'm going to see if I can find some images, because I know that I've got some images about that, and it's really, really interesting. So I think it is here. If I can find, yeah, here we go. Right. So I'm going to share my screen again. And let's show you the difference between, as it were, neurotypical people and people with dyslexia. Please forgive me, I hadn't planned to. So this is me looking for it. Okay, here we are, right, images. Here we go, right, perfect. So I'm going to share my screen again. What I'm going to show you now is very, very interesting indeed. Share screen, here we go. When they tracked what happens with dyslexic people's eyes when we read, they found that on the left-hand side of the screen, this is more or less what you see. People without dyslexia tend to read in a zigzag, and a very regular straight zigzag from left to right, depending on which language you are reading. And you can see circles, and these circles are essentially where you're concentrating, and people concentrate 3 to 4 times per second on a particular area of a page when they're reading. On the right-hand side of the screen is what people with dyslexia do when they read. It's up and down, lots of concentration points. It's not regular in the same way that people without dyslexia have got regular reading patterns. And so one of the things we can do with this, and it's really, really simple, by the way, really, really simple. If you want to counteract this, I would recommend essentially 3 or 4 things. The first thing is make sure that the font you use is appropriate. So I believe Open Dyslexic was a font that was used on the PowerPoint slide. You can use any font that I would recommend, any font that is a humanist font. So Open Dyslexic is merely a humanist font. So let's explain what a humanist font is. There are essentially 4 types of font. Generally speaking, this isn't quite true, but please bear with me while I simplify things. The first type of font is a serif font, something like Times New Roman. And these serif fonts have got squiggly bits on the edges of the letters. These generally do not help people with dyslexia. And one of the reasons is that if letters are difficult enough to read, then why make them more complicated? So we think about it in those terms. So try to avoid serif fonts, like, for instance, Times New Roman with the twiddly bits on the end. The next type of font is what they call Gothic, a Gothic font. Now, Gothic fonts are not serif, they are sans serif. You can recognize a Gothic font because the strokes, the up and down strokes of B's and D's and P's and Q's are usually nothing more than vertical, and they're usually exactly the same length. And the circles of the P and the B and the Q, these are usually just circles, and the D is like a 3/4 circle, and an E is just a circle with something cut out of it. And so you can recognize a Gothic font because of its very rigorous, very regular shape, the vertical lines and the circular add-ons to these regular lines. Gothic fonts are not terribly good either. And in fact, it's Gothic fonts that Read Regular and Open Dyslexic and Dyslexia and Dyslexia and all these fonts tried to combat. The next style is what they call monospaced. Monospaced is when each letter occupies the same space on a page, no matter how big it is. So the letter I, for instance, the letter I will have the same space to its right and its left as the letter M. But the letter M is wider than the letter I. So on a monospaced typeface, you'll notice what look like spaces within words. This is also a bad idea to have. So try to avoid, if you can, try to avoid monospaced typeface. The next thing to do is look for humanist typefaces. And the great thing, if we keep this slide on, one of the great things, you can recognize humanist typefaces by, let's have a look at the word Lichterfeld at the end. The L and the I, forgive my pronunciation, Katrin, I feel ashamed of myself. The L and the I are not the same height. And that's really, really interesting. The upward strokes of a humanist font are not the same height as each other. So a D and a B, the upward stroke of the D and the B will not be the same height. The circles will not be perfect circles. They'll be slightly squashed or elongated circles. Often the upward vertical strokes will have some curves on them. This is what we call a humanist font. I thoroughly recommend my favorite humanist font, which is, and I'm going to type this in the chat box for you. My favorite humanist font is Leela Wadi. It's a really beautiful font, a really beautiful font. I'm also working with an organization called Omoguru, and they create fonts based on a lot of scientific research. And some of the Omaguru fonts are really good. Some not so good, but Omaguru Regular is a very good font. Omaguru Medium is a very good font. I love these things. Carter OS, Omaguru Regular, really good fonts. But Lilawati is a very good one. Any of the dyslexia fonts can help. One of the main reasons the dyslexia fonts tend to be accessible for people with dyslexia is not necessarily the structure of the letters, though. There's a number of other things about the Open Dyslexia font that accesses the visual, if you like, friendliness for dyslexic people. Number one, the letters are spaced slightly further apart. So what you need to do, absolutely anybody can do this. What you need to do is you need to make sure that, well, let me do this. Let me share my screen again, and this will show you exactly. So if you let me share my screen, this will show you exactly what I mean. So I've just found this. So what I have got in front of you is on the left and the right, you've got exactly the same text. But on the left, what I've done is I've taken the paragraphs and I've separated them. So instead of indenting the paragraphs, I've separated them. This helps people with dyslexia because it stops the text being a long stream of words. It makes it small, bite-sized chunks. The next thing we can do, if you watch the screen, what I've just done is I've turned it from a serif font to a sans serif font. This is Lilawati that I've used, by the way. So a sans serif font tends to be slightly easier on the eye than a serif font. Now, I don't know about you, but as a dyslexic person, I already see the left-hand paragraphs easier to read than the right-hand paragraphs. They have exactly the same text, by the way. The next thing you can do, space the letters out just a little bit. All I've done is I've gone into font, advanced, letter spacing. That's all I've done. I've spaced the letters out a little bit, tiny amount. If you want, you can also then go and do line spacing and space the lines out a tiny amount. It really, really helps. The next thing I did, if you look at the change of the screen, is I put a box around it with some faint background. It's very faint blue in the background. Very, very faint blue indeed. And then I separated the two boxes. And I can guarantee, that absolutely everybody that you give this to will find the writing on the left easier to read than the writing on the right. There is almost nobody who sees the paragraphs on the right as easier than the paragraphs on the left. Almost nobody. Doesn't matter whether you're dyslexic or not. Something else you can do, by the way, because of the eye tracking, make sure that your margins are a little bit narrower. Make sure your margins are a little bit narrower. So don't have page-to-page margins starting at the left and ending at the right. Have them narrower. And that's easier for people with dyslexia, for the eyes to focus on, a lot easier. So little things like that, just little tricks like that mean that when we see things like Open Dyslexic, it's a fine font, but almost any humanist font can do the same thing. As long as it's the right size, no smaller than 12 point, never smaller than 12 point. Of course, some fonts are bigger than others, so use your judgment. Yep, the background color, the spacing of the letters, whether it's a humanist font, just break the paragraphs up so it's not one continuous stream of writing. That's all we need to do. Any other questions about this?
I'd like to add something here because with one of my students, I also suggested that he actually uses on Word. He uses like a different background when he has to read or write text and the font. And very often in Germany, teachers tend to use yellow to avoid this kind of black on white. And he said, it's not yellow for me. I was diagnosed and my color is blue. So that obviously when they diagnose this dyslexia issue, that they also check which color would be best on your brain to process text, and say, well, then choose a light blue background, and when you send out the letter, just change the background. So, you know, so that I found that quite interesting, that it's also a personal issue.
It's very personal. And in fact, almost all aspects of dyslexia will differ between one and another person. There's a person in Britain called Professor Elliott, who is a university professor in Durham University, who believes that this means that there is no such thing as dyslexia. He's wrong, because he's taken the wrong philosophical position of essentialism. You have to be able to boil something down to its core to identify it. And you cannot be an essentialist where reading and writing is concerned, for all sorts of good reasons. But yeah, sure. I mean, if people have issues with color, which is more of an Irlen syndrome issue than a dyslexia issue, but if people have issues with color, let them choose their own colors. We work online, we work digitally all the time. There's no reason that everything has to be black and white. And if you recall, when I showed you the optical illusions, and it looked like there was movement when there was no movement, one of the reasons they can do that is they're using colors that are really stark, really high contrast colors. Now, there are international guidelines. This is really interesting. There are international guidelines for accessibility in writing, web accessibility. If you look online at WISC, and I think it's WISC3 or something, you'll find international guidelines on web accessibility and creating accessible writing. They don't take dyslexia into account. They say have high contrast between text and page. People with dyslexia struggle with high contrast, which is why, as you said, Kirsten, a faint blue background can really reduce that contrast. If people have to write and print out, and you cannot have a faint blue background or a faint yellow background or a faint orange background, well, there are other things you can do. Instead of fiddling with the background, fiddle with the font. So change the color of the font. So the font is not black against white. The font is 80% gray or 80% dark blue, something like that. And again, that reduces the contrast. That reduces the contrast. So yeah, reduce the contrast, break the text up, space out the words, reduce the size of the margins, and use a humanist font, such as Open Dyslexic or Lila Wadi. And these are really interesting things to know. I'm going to ask, can you share, please? Can you share the Jamboard again? It'd be really interesting if we could do this. And I think everybody still has the link to the Jamboard, so we all have access to the Jamboard. Lovely. Can we now go to page 1 of the Jamboard? So we're on page 2 currently. If we can go to page 1 of the Jamboard. Thank you. Research over a 15-year period from roughly 2004 to roughly 2017. So more or less 15 years, 13 years. Research over a 15-year period has shown that in schools, the children themselves or the students themselves and the teachers and their friends, their peer group, they categorize dyslexia in roughly 1 of 4 ways. Really interesting. And what I've got here, what I've got in these 1 of 4 ways is in the middle, the categories are the patient, the campaigner, the hemispherist, and the student. So the green post-it notes in the very center, these are the 4 ways people categorize dyslexia: the patient, the campaigner, the hemispherist, and the student. At the top, there is a post-it note to say whether this categorization of dyslexia had a positive or a negative effect on a student's academic achievement and mental health. And at the bottom, in the yellow post-it notes, it tells you what the patient, the campaigner, the hemispherist, and the student mean. Now, I have mixed up these post-it notes. So I still want 3 rows of post-it notes, but I would very much like it if people could now swap these post-it notes around so you can have the patient, the campaigner, the hemispherist, and the student correctly aligned with the description and the outcome. Okay, so please get to work. I'm going to give you a minute or so to swap these cards around. Thank you. I always love watching this happen. I'm going to ask you to stop there. I'm going to ask you to stop there. Are you okay? Continue if you like. I think there's some things you still have to change, but yeah, there we go. Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. This is perfect. So what we have, oh, no, it's not perfect. There's something still you need to change on the top row. There you go. Nearly. Still something you need to change on the top row. One more thing on the top row. Yes, perfect. Oh, nearly. Well, you've got it the exact wrong way around. I think I know what you're looking at. There you go. Yep, that's it. That's exactly it. It's really interesting. There have been a number of studies, long-term studies. One of them went over a long period of time. And they showed that essentially people categorize their dyslexia and the dyslexia of others in one of four ways. Either as what they call the patient, which is when neurodiversity, such as dyslexia, is looked upon as a medical condition. And this had a negative impact on the neurodiverse students' mental health and learning outcomes. So the dyslexic students who looked at themselves as having a medical issue had bad mental health outcomes and bad academic outcomes. The second category was the student, who these people looked at dyslexia as being a learning difficulty or a learning deficiency or a reading and writing deficiency. Leserechtschreibschwäche. Forgive my bad German pronunciation, but it's effectively reading writing difficulty, reading writing weakness. People who looked at dyslexia in this way had negative mental health outcomes and negative academic outcomes. They looked at themselves as negatively. The campaigner and the hemispherist. The campaigner looked at neurodiversity as being having responsibilities on others to provide an adequate learning example, an adequate learning condition. Yeah, it does. Yeah, the LRS it means weakness, and this is an unfortunate use of the language. But then in English, dyslexia, it's got this negative dys at the beginning as well. So yeah, the campaigner looked upon dyslexia as placing a responsibility on others to create a more encouraging and open and friendly learning environment. These people had positive mental health outcomes and positive academic outcomes. And finally, the hemispherist, and I am a hemispherist through and through. I believe that dyslexia is a different way of processing information, a different way of thinking, a different way of coming up with ideas. Hemispherists tend to have a positive outcome in terms of their mental health and their academic outcomes. And by the way, I didn't know I was dyslexic until I was 30. I struggled at school terribly. I was the bottom of the class in absolutely everything, absolutely everything. I was told to leave most classes. There were some classes I didn't have to take because everyone knew I wouldn't do them. I would get E's and F's and U's regularly in my exams. I got 2 mediocre sort of null 8 sort of abitur results, and that was it. I'm dyslexic. I started to look at myself. I found out I was dyslexic at 30, started to look at myself differently. And hey, presto, I've just got myself my PhD. So it's possible. It's possible. And it's partly to do with your attitude towards yourself and your attitude towards those people you work with. Well, this is all very interesting, but I'm going to challenge you now. I'd like you now to turn to page 2 of this Jamboard. And I would like you to decide which of these descriptions and associations of dyslexia you have got, which are positive and which are negative. On one side of the Jamboard, on the right-hand side of the Jamboard, I want you to put all the positive descriptions. And on the left-hand side of the Jamboard, I want you to put the negative descriptions. Thank you very much. So yeah, absolutely. Things like visualization, very positive. Things like scared of or difficulty with, very negative.
Can we have a middle?
I tend to be cruel. I tend to be cruel. Go and have a neutral one. Yeah, I don't mind. But most of the neutrals end up being kind of negative because they can't do it, or they're scared of doing it, that sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah, look at that. This is classic, by the way. Everybody comes up with far more negatives than positives. Absolutely everybody. It's absolutely 100% classic. Don't worry about it. Don't feel that you've done anything wrong or that you're terrible people. Yeah, no, everybody feels like this. But it's really interesting. Now we know a little bit more about dyslexia, about, yes, the fact that we've got phonological processing deficit and executive function problems, but we've got high levels of creativity and we've got high levels of visualization, and we can join the dots and we can see things that other people can't see connections that other people can't see. Once we realize this, a colleague of mine, a woman called Kate Griggs, who runs an organization called Made by Dyslexia, she was on the BBC recently. Colleague of mine, I've met her a couple of times. She's not a colleague of mine. I've met her a couple of times. I'm trying to vicariously live my life through her. She's a very lovely woman. She was on the BBC recently, and she was saying, why do we keep describing dyslexia in negative terms? And we know from the research that when we describe dyslexia in negative terms, it tends to harm people with dyslexia. So you have homework now. This is pretty much the end of our session. I'm not going to bore the pants off anybody, but it's exactly the same problem with autism and ASD. Yeah, we talk in England, autism spectrum disorder. I get rid of this language. To me, it's the autism spectrum. I get rid of the word disorder. I hate that word disorder. Your homework, if you would like to do any homework, and you don't have to, is you've got the link for this. Open up the link. Have a look at the negatives and try to reframe them as positives. Try to think how you can write them in more positive ways. So let's take visuals all too busy, that lots of things where you could say a high level of visual ability if we can control it, that sort of thing. So what we now need to do is take these negatives and reframe them as positives, or at the very least neutrals. And when we can do that, our attitude towards our students changes immeasurably. But more important, the student's ability to learn and have better mental health outcomes changes as well. There are 3 days of dyslexia activities for you. The dyslexia activities cover phonological processing, they cover morphological awareness, they cover a number of things. I'm sure you've seen the program for it. Don't take too long doing them, but do try to engage. I mean, this isn't supposed to be a task. It's not supposed to be hard work, but do try to engage because it gives you a very good grounding in what dyslexia is, and therefore how we can start to change our attitudes and change our practices towards dyslexia. My name is Martin Bloomfield. I will be here online for as long as you want, answering as many questions as you like. And if anybody would like you can always, oopsie daisy, you can always contact me via this. martin.bloomfield@gmail.com. That's my email address. You can always contact me that way. But if anyone has got any questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
I have a question, Martin. Thank you for the really interesting presentation. I learned a lot of stuff that I didn't know before, and it makes perfect sense with the student that I have. I have an IT innovation manager, and so, you know, he's very creative. He's even in all his life, I see that he's very creative, and he's always from the beginning been upfront and said he's dyslexic, so he doesn't like to do the reading tasks. He doesn't want to learn grammar, or he has difficulty learning grammar. And I've probably sometimes pushed him into some reading things because I probably struggle with how to get him to remember new vocabulary. How do I help him improve? Because he really struggles as an English language student.
Okay. Yep. So one of the first things to remember is that when he says he doesn't like reading, he doesn't like grammar, he's lying. He doesn't mean he doesn't like grammar. What he means is he doesn't like grammar the way he's always been taught grammar. And that's a really interesting thing to remember, that when we talk about this kind of thing, what we really mean is grammar can be engaged with in a number of different ways, and so can reading. So I'm just going to share something for you. If I found the right PowerPoint. I have a disk, I have a USB stick filled with disks, and I think I've got the right PowerPoint here. It's not the right one, but I'll see if I can find another one. There are essentially three things that we can do really easily. It could be this. Yeah, words and pictures. I think that's the one. Yeah. So there are essentially three things that we can do really easily. Okay, right. So the first thing, and this will be part of the work over the week. So it's very simple stuff. So don't worry about any of it. The first thing to think about is morphology. Now, English, specifically English, is a wonderfully morphological language. Morphology is building bricks. It's Lego. It's word Lego, essentially. And people with dyslexia love word Lego. And in fact, I learned to spell using morphology. So many people with dyslexia learn to spell using morphology. And the research is clear. Understanding morphological patterns and structures helps people with dyslexia learn to write. Doesn't help them at reading. That's different. That's when we space the letters out and change the fonts. That makes reading easier. But writing, use morphology. In terms of learning to write, explore the morphology, explore the prefixes and the suffixes and the root words. Play around with them, turn it into a game. He will adore that. I guarantee he'll adore it. Another thing, I'm gonna, I don't know whether, right, so here's this, this is great. I'm gonna show you this. This is something which I did a long time ago. I have drawn English grammar for you. I hope you can all see this circle and triangle. And this circle and triangle is a representation of English grammar. I did this with a dyslexic student years ago. He told me he was dyslexic and he was 45 or 49 or something, and he'd been trying to learn English since he was a child and couldn't grasp it. And he said to me, "What does grammar look like?" And I thought, what a wonderfully dyslexic thing to say. So we drew grammar. What you have is you have three quadrants: the past, the present, and the future. And there's a triangle inside these quadrants representing the simple, the perfect, and the continuous. And what you can see is that you can actually turn this triangle around inside the circle. So the first thing to do is just make sure that we know how to construct the continuous, for instance, the verb to be plus ing, easy. We know how to construct the perfect, subject, have, past participle, piece of cake. Nothing hard about structures at all. So once we get that, then we try to simplify what they do. So all of this stuff that you know about the perfect somehow talks about things that were true in the past that are still true now. That doesn't work. It doesn't wash with a lot of people, because most of the time it's not true, by the way. All the perfect generally does is it talks about the past without a reference point. You know, I've been to Australia. You don't know when, but you know I've been. That sort of thing. So we know what the perfect does. We know what the continuous does. It talks about temporary activities. We know what the simple does. It gives facts. So if we say, okay, so turn this triangle so the continuous is pointing to the present, I am speaking. Turn it so it's pointing to the future, I will be speaking. Turn it so it's pointing to the past, I was speaking. Piece of cake, really easy. Turn the triangle so the perfect is talking to the present, I have spoken. Turn it so it's pointing at the past, I had spoken. Turn it so it's pointing at the future, I will have spoken. Piece of cake, nothing hard about that. You can turn it so that as it is now, the perfect and the continuous are both pointing to the present. I have been speaking, or whatever. Now, it might not speak to you, but I've worked with a lot of dyslexic people, and we've looked at this and we've used it. And what strikes them about this is they can suddenly see how English fits together. They see the connections, they see the structures. A simple visualization like this is really, really helpful for people with dyslexia. And that's what we mean by visual thinking and structural understanding, and seeing the way that things connect. So what we've got is a perfect example of English. This is the structural construct of English, and it really helps people with dyslexia understand what they're trying to speak, essentially. And you can do it with almost anything. You can create something like that for German, certainly. You can create it for all sorts of different subjects, for any subject you want. Now, once we've gone on to the morphology, let me tell you something else. And I talk about this as well. I talk about this in the work that I give you over the week. We talk about embedded imagery. Embedded imagery is really, really important. So when you're teaching new words, new vocabulary, what you want to do is you want to use an image that represents that vocabulary, but you want to make the image and the word embedded within each other. Here we have the word whole, and the O is represented by a hole. This is an embedded image, and it accesses something in the brain called the ventral pathway, or depending on your view of the brain, the ventral pathways. It's indeterminate, I'm not certain. But the ventral pathways are generally called the what pathways. In other words, they help you comprehend, they help you understand. So if the ventral pathways are damaged, not only do you find facial recognition harder, but you can't recognize expressions on people's faces. So what embedded images do is they access ventral pathways. They not only help you understand what a word is, they help people access the meaning for words. And it's the meaning that we want when we're teaching reading. We don't just want to teach the science of reading, understanding phonological sort of mapping, so okay, this phoneme maps to that grapheme. You don't, that's not teaching reading. That's teaching some form of I don't know, code breaking or something. But when you want to teach comprehension, ventral pathways really help. And to access the ventral pathways, embedded imagery is a fantastic way of doing it. Fantastic way of doing it. This is another example of embedded imagery. This is something I created about 2 years ago now, or a year and a half ago, sometime during lockdown anyway. Talking about the dyslexia underground, how actually dyslexia is a complex network of different things that crisscross. And I created it to look like the London Underground. And you've got the red pathway is phonology, which talks about translating written sounds into words. The green pathway, the light green pathway, is working memory, which is applying short-term recall. The dark blue is sequencing, which is about time, space, and ordering. The gray is convergence, which is about eye tracking and focus, and how these things all crisscross. This is an embedded image because the concept of a network of things intersecting, actually represented as a network of things intersecting, helps people understand what we're talking about. And this kind of thing is perfect for people with dyslexia. Kirsten, I believe you're...
Yes. Martin, I think we have to stop here because we
I
already
believe we
ran a bit
probably do.
over time, but I know that's the
I'm
way
so
with
sorry.
like structuralist thinkers, because they see the big picture and they just
Yeah.
keep going. And I think you're already
Bouncing around.
moving a lot into the
Yeah.
task and the more information
Yes.
that people get in
Yes.
week
Absolutely.
3.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you very much. I think that was very enlightening to a lot of us. And can I just turn over to our hosts for week 3, Katrin and Grace, maybe explaining a bit more, if you like, what's going to come up in week 3. I'm happy to share the screen of the module if you want me to. So over to you. But thanks a lot, Martin. I think that was fantastic. I learned a lot. So.
Yes, I can only add to what you have said so far, Kirsten. Wonderful overview. And I think it's so important to be aware of the neurodiversity of our learners and of the spectrum that people offer us sitting in our courses. And as Martin mentioned, most of the activities are supposed to raise our awareness. So go through them, make them several times if necessary to really get a feeling what it means to have this different way of processing information. There's one discussion forum 3.5. There we would kindly ask you to upload any comments on the activities or on the items mentioned beforehand, or anything else like the rephrasing sentences that we had on the Jamboard here. And then we are looking forward to your comments concerning this topic. And I would like to hand over to Grace then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Grace Alchini, and I will be in charge of the second part of the week, in which we will deal with infographics. Firstly, we will reflect on the relevance of infographics in today's world. Then we will learn, if you haven't learned yet, how to make an infographic. And here, of course, you can take what we have seen with Martin into account. Then we will discuss some activities in which students will have to use infographics, use ready-made infographics or infographics made by the teacher, and also design their own infographics. As regards activities, there will be 2 optional discussion forums, and the idea there is, well, if you want to express your views or share your experience, yeah, that's why they are optional. And then we will have one discussion in which you will be invited to analyze and comment on the activities that are shown as samples, yeah, the activities I mentioned before. And finally, we have a task in which you will be asked to design activities based on infographics, or even design your own infographics. You have a choice of activities, of tasks that you can present. And everything will be online. And of course, I will be checking together with Katrin the forums to see if you have any questions, and well, feel free to ask and express your views as much as you want to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Grace. Then last words from me. I know a lot of people struggled with the task in week 2 for some reason, because copyright isn't so easy for all of us. Please remember the tasks and the discussion forums remain open, usually till the end of the 5 weeks, so you can take it in your own time. And not everybody always has the same time or the same pace for doing things. The same goes for week 3. Also, when you contribute and you post links. So please make sure that you tell us something about the link and why it's important, because otherwise the rest of the participants won't have a clue what they're going to do with this link. So we noticed that a couple of times, but usually the moderators, and I see some of them here, will help and also ask additional questions and comment on the others. The active contribution, exchanging views, is just as important as the input that comes from our end. I'd like to thank again Martin for a fantastic session today. We're going to upload the link. It might take a while for Zoom to present us with a recording, and it's going to be turned into a YouTube video, so you can watch the session again. The links to the Jamboard and also the other links, for example, how you can check with Microsoft if a certain humanist font is available for your Microsoft or whatever, I will also share in the 3.2 section. so that you can also check again on some of the links that Katrin, I, and Martin put into the chat box. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording now, and thank you very much for joining our session today.